I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler. We are here with episode number 14 and the first ever episode of Smart Drug Smarts recorded in the morning. It's actually just past 7 a.m. here, so now I feel like I'm doing a morning radio show, which is kind of a weird thing. Normally I do this late at night when all else is done for the day, but actually went to bed a little bit early last night following the advice of so many of our people that have been on this podcast and trying to get a little bit more sleep work into my own schedule. And so I'm taking on kind of the Benjamin Franklin early to bed, early to rise thing, and this is a early morning edition of Smart Drug Smarts. Not sure what time it is there. We got a great interview for you today. This is with Dr. Terry Wahls. She's going to talk to us all about nerves, neurology, diet, how these things all interplay together. It's kind of a counterpoint episode, actually, to our episode with Dr. Neil Bernard from a few weeks ago. Dr. Bernard was espousing the virtues of a vegan diet, and we're going to hear a very sort of polar opposite recommendation coming out of Dr. Wahls, but also very much focused on nerves, brain, and overall health. So anyway, we're going to give you both ends of that spectrum. Also, if you hang around today, there's an interesting kind of like almost a little mystery thing I wanted to throw at the audience and see what you guys think about based on an email that I got a couple of days ago. So I'll toss that at you in the ruthless listener retention gimmick at the end of the episode. But first, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Okay, so for This Week in Neuroscience, the only thing that actually has to do with this particular week is that I got an email from a friend this week that clued me into this thing. And this is it's only tangentially related to human neuroscience, but it is kind of cool and weird. So a friend sent me an email about zombie ants. These are not actual undead supernatural ants. This is a type of fungus that affects ants and kills them, but prior to killing them makes them behave in particularly non-ant-like ways, which are much more conducive to the procreation of this type of fungus than it is to the ants themselves. So the ants will start going to little ant convulsions, and the other ants look at them and like, dude, what's up with that guy? And if they catch him in time, they try to sort of shoo off this fungally infected ant somewhere far, far away so he can't infect the rest of the colony. Sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't. So if you're an ant and you're infected with this fungus, the name of which will be on the website, but I will not attempt to pronounce now, what'll happen to you is you'll start getting your internal non-vital tissues eaten first, and you start waddling around and not doing your normal ant stuff correctly. But then what happens next is if you haven't been spotted by your fellow ants and carried off to parts unknown, you're going to drop down from the tree colony that you live in and find a nice spot on like a leaf stalk, I guess in the feeding area where your other ants might be passing through on their way out to forage for food for the day. And you're going to clamp your mandibles onto a leaf and basically sit there and wait to die. So you've got this death lock on your mandibles on this leaf. You're going to die, and you're going to have this giant fungal plume grow out the back of your ant head. So you're going to have this scary ant corpse with a big fungal sprout coming out of it, and then the fungus's spores, which are the fungal equivalent to eggs that you would lay, are going to be coming out the back of your head and spreading to other ants and things in that region. None of which is good for your fellow ant colony members that might have survived your untimely demise. And according to David Hughes, you can find whole graveyards of ants with 20 or 30 dead ants in a square meter. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. I mean, I guess the only reason this is really relevant is because I thought it was so cool that, a fungus doesn't just kill something and eat it, which would be kind of the normal means of predation in the animal world, but it actually affects the neurology of the animal before that animal dies and kind of makes the ant into this slave creature, which has become like a sex organ for the fungus, rather than behaving in its own antly ways. Luckily, we don't have anything like that we know about in our human species, but pretty cool that exists. And they still do not know exactly by what mechanism it is that the fungus affects the actual, neurological behavior of the ant, but it very clearly does. And also this fungal species and ants have apparently been in sort of a, biological arms race or standoff or whatever for a long, long, long time. They found fossilized plant evidence of ants doing this same darn thing that are 48 million years old. So zombie ants, totally predating the whole human species. Pretty good stuff. So stick that in your hat for your next Halloween costume. A zombie ant could be you.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so with no further ado, let's go straight into the main interview. This is Dr. Terry Wahls that I'm speaking with, and we're going to be talking all about nutrition, neurology, nerve health, and things of that ilk. You first sort of came across my radar screen when I saw your TED Talk probably about a year ago. And at that point, I was actually still eating a totally vegan diet. I'd been vegan for about 6 years. And your TED Talk, among other things that were coming to my attention at that time, were one of the things that led to my own transition to a paleo diet about 6 months ago. So you definitely have had impact on my life personally. And yeah, I found your talk really, really interesting and kind of wanted to see I guess probably we should start with sort of the backstory for the listeners who might not be familiar with you already on sort of your personal journey as an MD and as somebody who has essentially cured your own MS.
Well, cure is probably too strong a word, but markedly, I've definitely changed the trajectory of my illness. I'm not normal yet. Standing is still fatiguing. Walking a mile is okay. Walking more than a mile would be pretty tough. Standing an hour to give a lecture to my students, I can do. Standing for 2 hours, I would be pretty tired. So I'm steadily improving, and maybe in another 5 years, I'll be completely normal. I don't know. Had I not made my discoveries, I'm sure I'd be bedridden by now and probably beginning to struggle with a lot of cognitive decline.
Did you feel a mental rebound as well as a physical rebound?
Oh, absolutely. I'll tell the story and I'll comment on the sequence of what came back. Okay, so when I was first diagnosed in 2000, it was because of problems. I had started stumbling and falling, and my spouse convinced me that I needed to go see my physician. At that time, the doc looked back in my medical record and saw that about 12 years earlier, I had been seen with an episode of visual dimming in my right eye, and that had improved. I'd also had some episodes of episodic electrical jolts of pain, which had been an episodic problem also since those 12 years. At the time when I saw the neurologist, they did a big workup, MRIs of my neck, my spinal cord, my brain, nerve conduction velocities, visual evoked potentials, lots and lots of blood tests. And no obvious abnormalities. There were a couple of lesions in my spinal cord at the level of my cervical spine. And my doc said, the last thing is the spinal tap. If that's negative, then you just have a mild degeneration of your spinal cord, and things will probably not get too much worse. So he did the spinal tap, and I had oligobands of protein, which meant there was too much antibody in my spinal fluid. And he told me that I had relapsing remitting MS, and that my first episode had probably been the visual dimming due to optic neuritis. Being an academic doc, I wanted to see the best people in the country. So I went to the Cleveland Clinic, which has an international reputation. And they looked at my records, looked at my scans, did an exam, and said, yes, you have relapsing remitting MS. They told me to begin a disease-modifying drug. And at that time, I decided to take Copaxone, which is a daily injection. Over the next 3 years, I had just one episode of weakness of my right arm. And since the goal of taking the disease-modifying injections was to reduce the frequency and severity of acute worsening or relapses, that would be considered a huge success. But the problem was I had continued to steadily decline. My strength and endurance were much worse. My physicians told me that I should get a cane. They said, no, a scooter. And then I said, well, no, you have so much back fatigue, you should probably get a tilt-recline wheelchair. And we need to get a recliner for your office. And that was 2003. So in 2004, I was taking chemotherapy in the form of Novantrone in an effort to slow my disease progression. And that's when I decided to start reading the medical literature myself. I would spend most nights searching PubMed.gov and reading some studies about the animal models of multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, Lou Gehrig's, Huntington's disease, because these were all conditions in which the brain and spinal cord would shrink. What I decided was a common theme in all these conditions was that the mitochondria were not working very well, leading to an early signal of death of the brain cells and therefore shrinkage of the brain and spinal cord. I continued to look, and I was looking for fancy drug studies that would protect the mitochondria. Then finally, it occurred to me that I should be looking for things that I could access, things like vitamins and supplements. And I was able to find some studies that had protected mouse brains and the little mitochondria. And so I started translating these mouse-sized doses of vitamins and supplements into human-sized doses and began self-experimentation. And after 6 months, I was disgusted. I thought I'm wasting my money, and I quit. 2 days later, my spouse brought in the vitamins and said, I really think you ought to try these again. And I took them, and the next day I could get up and go back to work. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah. Well,
so
what happened in those 2 days?
I decided a couple of weeks later that I would test that out again, and I had the same result. I was exhausted, couldn't get out of bed, went back on the vitamins, and could again get up. So my conclusion was that my vitamins were doing something. Maybe all they were doing was slowing down the speed of my decline, but that was huge. And so that really encouraged me. I was more excited about reading, tinkering with my own healthcare, and thinking that, okay, there's a role for me here to try and figure out what's going on and to do the best that I could. So I keep reading. I slowly add a few things. In the summer of 2007, I discovered the Institute of Functional Medicine, and that's an organization that's devoted to using the latest basic science to help healthcare practitioners do a better job of taking care of chronic disease.
What is basic science versus whatever the alternative version of science would be?
So basic science would be studies in the animal models of disease. They're really looking at how our cells are functioning and what the latest physiology research is telling us about health and disease. Because, usually it takes 20 to 30 years for our discoveries in basic science to make it into clinical practice. I was intrigued. I got their course, Neuroprotection, a Functional Medicine Approach for Common and Uncommon Neurologic Syndromes. I took that course, and I'm going through the slides, listening to the lectures, going through the text. I'm sitting at the kitchen table. My kids are laughing at me because I'm going over the same stuff over and over. But I really deepened my understanding further of brain biology, the things that I can do. And so now I have a longer list of nutrients and supplements. And I began taking those, and that's helpful. But what I think was probably the brilliant move was I took this long list of nutrients and supplements and said, what if I look through where I get these nutrients and supplements in the food supply? Because then I would probably get hundreds or maybe thousands of other compounds that are really good for my cells and my brain and my mitochondria if I'm getting it all from the food. So that's more research. And, I ask my registered dietitian colleagues where these things are in the food supply, and they don't know. And I go to the health science library, and the medicine text and the nutrition text don't have that information. So again, I'm going back to the internet, things like the Linus Pauling Center, the World's Healthiest Foods. And I slowly create a list of the great food sources for all of these nutrients. And then I begin reorganizing my eating. At the same time, I had discovered electrical stimulation of muscles and had, because I sit on the Institutional Review Board, which reviews research projects every week. And I had been assigned to review Dr. Shields' research on electrical stimulation of muscles. And I read through the protocol, was intrigued. So I convinced my physical therapist to let me try that as well. So that fall, I created this very intensive nutrition program. I worked with my therapist to create this exercise program and electrical therapy to my muscles. And at this time, I should tell you, I can't sit up in a regular chair because that exhausts me. My muscles are so weak. I have to either be in bed or in a recliner and leaning back so far that my knees are as high as my nose. I've been losing my keys and my phone. I had to replace my phone 3 times that summer. And I'm keeping a notebook with the list of everything that I need to do, just because my memory is getting to be a problem. And that's when I'm starting all of this. So in November, I start my very intense program. And, I think my employer, the VA and the university, were trying to force me to face that I couldn't do my work. So they had, earlier that summer, told me I was going to be assigned to this new clinic called the Traumatic Brain Injury Clinic as of January. And I'd be seeing patients directly without residents being involved. And so in July, I thought that was going to be the end of that I'd be having to finally take a medical retirement. But as it turns out, in January, when this clinic starts, I can drive my scooter over to the clinic, but this time I can take my cane and walk using a cane between exam rooms, and I'm seeing patients. And at the end of that first clinic, I'm like, well, actually, I don't feel too bad. And by February, the scooter is staying in my office, and I'm walking throughout the hospital with my cane. And in March, there's no cane. In May, I get on my bike, and I bike around the block. And then in September, so this is now just 9 months after I've started my protocol, I was able to do a 18-mile bicycle ride with my family. Now I had to take several breaks, mind you, where I got off my bike and laid down in the grass and waited for a few minutes, then got up on it. But I was able to do that 18-mile bike ride. The following year, I did a trail ride in the Canadian Rockies. And then the year after that, I was able to construct and start a clinical trial that tests my protocol in others with secondary progressive multiple sclerosis.
That's fantastic.
It's been an amazing journey.
Yeah, it was. I mean, honestly, it's like sort of a moving TED Talk to see the photographic progression of sort of the baseline that you were starting from when you started that protocol, and then the things you were doing by the end. Well, one question actually I sort of wanted to touch on. The TED Talk that you gave, if I remember correctly, was about, it says it was uploaded on November 30th, 2011, and they actually put a note on it specifically that this talk is a personal narrative and is not yet backed by larger experimentation. And I know that you've been working in the time since that talk to, get more clinical trials and things like that to sort of validate some of the things that you're talking about now.
So let me update you with that. So we presented our preliminary results to the 2011 Neuroscience Conference, and we were given hot topic status because our preliminary results were so exciting. We have now had the first 10 people complete their 12 months. And we've written up those findings. And the question was, could people implement everything? If they did we harm them? And then if they implemented stuff, what happened? So we wrote up those findings, and we've submitted it to the Multiple Sclerosis Journal, and now it's in the process of peer review. So I can't really tell you the findings, but I can make a couple of other observations.
Sure.
We were so excited by what we saw in the first 10. And the IRB said, my protocol was so radical, we couldn't do all 20 at once. We had to do 10, submit a safety report, then they let us do the second 10. So when we did our first 10, we had our preliminary results. We were very excited. I write up another protocol back to the people who funded us. And I said, these results are so exciting. What we are now proposing is that you give us another $50,000 so we could do MRIs of the brain at 1 month and at 12 months so we could understand the mechanisms, why we're seeing the results that we're seeing. And we also added some more tests on the nutritional markers and markers of who and what's living in people's poop and what level of toxins people have stored in their fat. So we have a lot more mechanisms now about why we are seeing the changes. Now, I think it's very telling that when I write the grant back to my original funders, which are direct charity of MS of Canada, that they said, yep, we love your work, we'll give you another $60,000. And so we're able to add the MRIs and those additional biomarker studies. That second wave is now going on, and they'll finish up in this coming December. And of course, we are very excited about what we're seeing. And so I decided, it's time to do a third wave. So I write up another protocol. and I send it back to Direct MS Charity and say, okay, here's our preliminary results so far, and this is the research I've got proposed next, and now we'd like to ask for $75,000. And they gave me money again. So the people who get to see my work have enough faith that they keep giving me money. And I think that's a very, the public can take that as a very positive sign. It will be very interesting to see, because the people who will be reviewing our papers will be other academic neurologists. And most of these neurologists are likely funded by drug companies now, because this is a $15 billion industry. And the question that we can all ask is, will they be impressed by what they're seeing, or will they be threatened by what they're seeing, that you can get very interesting results without taking toxic drugs? And I don't know how hard or how easy it will be for us to get accepted by peer-reviewed neurologists. So I'm hoping I'll get an answer very quickly, either yes or no. And if it's no, then I'll go to other scientific journals that will probably be more open, such as some of the journals of complementary alternative medicine.
One question to circle back to something you said earlier. You said that you wanted to do maybe 20 people in the initial study, but that it was so controversial what you were proposing that you could only do 10 at the first go-round. What was controversial about giving people what sounds like a bunch of vegetables and natural food products and meat?
There are a couple of things. One, scientists really like to do studies one mechanism at a time. So when you get results, I can say it was this molecule that was affected. So because I do many interventions, a lot of reviewers don't like that study design. It's too complicated. That's one strike I have against me. The other strike is that everything was based on either the vitamins and supplements from animal model studies. The diet is a paleo diet, and there are not a lot of published studies that are prospective using paleo diets. The exercise and other electrical stimulation had certainly been studied, but none of them had been studied in MS. And so people were concerned that by combining all of this together, there might be some adverse event in that, since there was only one human that this had ever been reported in for safety, that they really needed to have a smaller group for the initial safety work. And that really is very typical. Usually in a phase 1 trial, you'll have 5 to 10 people to confirm that you aren't hurting people. And then you'll go up to 20 or 40. So that's not unusual. I would also say I think it's remarkable that I got this study approved. And I think part of the reason it was approved is that I'm a member of the Institution Review Board, the committee that has to approve these things. And all of my colleagues had seen me be walking around, and over the years get into the wheelchair, get progressively more severely disabled. And then they saw suddenly I'm up walking around looking really quite remarkably well. And so they wanted to have this study happen. And I think had they not actually seen me, they would have been much more concerned about the safety. It would have been even harder to get the study approved.
As you mentioned, you're studying so many simultaneous changes in people's diet, what they're putting into themselves, and probably by virtue of eating more of the good stuff, having a lot less of the bad stuff and the toxins. There's a lot of changes happening at once. Anecdotally, do you think that people are doing themselves more of a disservice by starving their brain of the things that we really should be getting from a healthy diet, or that the greater problem is that we're adding all these toxins by eating processed foods and things that would never normally be a part of our diet?
Well, my perspective is that for all of us, we're biochemical factories, and we're self-correcting. When you can't self-correct, self-regulate, you end up dying. If you can't do the biochemistry, of course, you're dead. And the efficiency of the thousands of enzymes that run my chemistry varies. So I have some very efficient enzymes and some, or many, not so efficient enzymes. And it's the interaction of the unique collection of enzymes that I have and my exposure to toxins, my inadequate or adequacy of my diet, my stress hormones, my exercise level, all together that will make me have, in my case, MS, or in your case, let's say bipolar or schizophrenia, or high blood pressure, or rheumatoid arthritis. So the disease that you and I get is an interaction of our unique DNA heritage, that is our enzymes, and the accumulation of all the choices we make with what we eat, what we expose ourselves to. So it may have been nutrient deficiencies. It may have been food sensitivities. It may have been the years of solvents I was exposed to as an artist and somebody who refinished furniture and then got into the gross anatomy lab. I have a lot of exposures. In our clinical trial, we see some very common exposures to a lot of toxins. I think several of the folks probably have food sensitivity and environmental sensitivities as part of their problem. But we all have a unique story of what were the problems that got us ill. And, my protocol, in essence, really is teaching people how to maximize their health-promoting behaviors. I give them a very structured daily log they fill in, which helps them make the correct choices. We fill them up with great food, and I specifically exclude some of the more toxic foods. And over the year, we see, very exciting stuff.
Is this protocol that you've given to people, is this publicly available on your website or elsewhere?
What people can do is they can go buy my book, Minding My Mitochondria, because in that book, I talk about my own personal experience and what I did in terms of the vitamins, the supplements, the dietary choices I made, the exercise, the E-stem. I discuss all of that.
Yeah.
And I explain the science behind what I was doing. When the IRB approved my protocol, their direction was copy what you did as closely as you can. The protocol that we're using is very, very close to what I described using for myself in that book. And I tell people, this is what I did. You got to work with your personal doc to have them supervise what you're doing. This is what I did, and this is why I did it. Now, everyone still has to work with their doc to make decisions about what's appropriate for them given their individual health circumstances. And I'll tell you, I've taken a lot of heat, a lot of grief from my professional colleagues for having published that book, which was simply a description of what I did and why. And a free acknowledgement that we didn't yet have clinical studies saying this was going to help other people or not.
Interesting. And so you kind of got a little bit of backlash, even though it was sort of a one-person anecdotal case study and.
It was a personal narrative. It was a personal narrative, and, it was a free acknowledgement. This was based on animal studies in terms of how I thought about nutrition and the belief that a nutrient-dense diet, exercise, and the E-stem, there's great literature to show that helps all sorts of health problems, not just MS. The brilliance of what I did is I said, you know what, we're going to do it all. I'll work at adding all of this to my life. And so that was a couple hours a day when I'm completely exhausted. It's no small task to have people try and start doing this. But of course, in my case, the results are stunning. We're very pleased with what we're seeing, and the people who fund my research are pleased enough they keep giving me more money.
Now, that all says a lot. Can we jump over to talking a little bit about sort of specifically the neurology and, maybe what's going on with brain cells and actually nerve cells throughout the body in MS, and how you think that the food prescription that you're advocating tends to reverse those effects?
The conventional description of what's going on in multiple sclerosis with conventional understanding is that my immune cells somewhere along the way got confused into thinking the myelin, which is the fatty insulation on the wiring in my brain, looks like it's an invading germ. So I send my immune cells into my brain to go attack myelin. I don't do it to every myelin molecule or every myelin structure, but I sort of do it in episodic spotty fashions throughout my brain. And we aren't sure why that happens. These attacks lead to scar, and I have acute worsening. That's where you get the relapse. And my brain gradually figures out how a workaround that's called the remission, and things improve. But gradually, over time and years, the transmission slows down in my brain. Thinking becomes slower. Walking becomes more and more uncoordinated. And often there's problems with balance, vision, and pain. Very common problems with MS. But we don't really know what causes the immune system to get confused that way. We think there's some sort of infection of either a virus or a bacteria that happens during adolescence. And this smolders for a decade or several. And then the body can't keep this infection cleared. That's when the immune cells begin attacking the brain. The goal is to have as few acute worsening episodes or relapses as possible. And the thinking is that that will make it more likely the person will still be walking at 10 years and still working at 10 years. Because right now, half the time within 10 years, you're out on disability because of disabling levels of fatigue. So the standard treatment is to give people immune suppressant drugs that are more and more potent and more aggressive. And the cost for those drugs are $1,000 to $4,000 a month, not cheap. And because these drugs are poisons attacking your immune cells, you're going to be at higher risk for infections, and you're not going to feel quite as well because these poisons are interfering with your cell biology. And they attack the most rapidly dividing cells, which are your immune cells. I come along, and my read of the literature is that study after study has said 70 to 95% of the risk of MS is not the genes, but it's the interaction of your genetic material, that is my enzyme efficiency, and my environmental exposures, my diet, toxins, stress loads, family connections. So I create a protocol that takes everything we know about those environmental health factors and say, what's the healthiest lifestyle issue that I could have in relationship to family? What's the healthiest lifestyle things I could do in relation to how I control my stress hormones? What's the most nutrient-dense diet I can create that would address the 31 micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants that I've identified that science says is critical for brain function? What can I do to make it easier for my body, my liver, and kidneys to excrete and dump the toxins I have stored in my body? How do I make exercise easier? How do I stimulate the nerve growth factors in my brain? The brilliance that I did was I created a protocol to address that 70 to 95% of what's driving how severe one MS is. And it's the same factors that lead to the severity of schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, that interfere with healing of traumatic brain injury, severity of your diabetes, obesity, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease. So this protocol that I've created, I use this in my traumatic brain injury clinic. I use this in my primary care clinic. And in those settings, the people who will embrace this protocol see steady reduction in their symptoms, improving in their health, improving the quality of their life, and over the next 3 years, needing fewer and fewer drugs. And often they get off all their drugs. When you create the environment for your cells, for optimal cellular health, your cells will repair themselves, improve the health of your organs, which in turn improves the health of the whole organism. That's you. It's much slower than drugs, but far, far more effective long term.
Tell me about this. So obviously, the whole crux of what you're talking about is allowing the body to do this itself based on giving it the micronutrient tools that it needs. Are there any drugs or supplements that you do recommend for the general public, and in particular, sort of for the neuro enhancement public?
For the public health version, I stress food. In my book, I talk about why you might need some B vitamins and sulfur amino acids, and that's sort of more personalized. In general, you have to look at your personal family history. If you've got a family history of bad brain, it could be a family history of Alzheimer's, dementia, or mood disorders, drug dependency. or heart disease, that tells me that the person is more likely to have less efficient enzymes for handling B vitamins. And so they may need a much higher intake of B vitamins than somebody who has no family history for any bad brain or bad heart stuff. And that's that kind of information that I talk about in my book, and I talk about in my clinical practice to help personalize based on your personal story and your family story. I make some predictions as to which enzymes are likely to be less efficient and for which circumstances we want to ramp up your nutrition. And it's helpful to really personalize that, because if I ramp up your nutrition inappropriately, as soon as you take vitamins and supplements, you can start getting the ratios out of alignment. So in most of the studies where we have not changed the diet and just had people take like vitamin A by itself or vitamin E by itself, the results are not helpful. They're either unremarkable or harmful. What those studies tell me is supplements without changing your diet probably do more harm than benefit. It's about eating a nutrient-dense diet so you get your vitamins in the appropriate ratios, and then having a individual personalized approach for when supplements might be appropriate. But for the public health message, a nutrient-dense diet will always be superior.
Yeah, one of the things that always irks me, as somebody that tries to eat really healthy, is the idea that because of just differences in soil quality versus what we had 100 years ago and things now, that even if you eat your healthy vegetables, they might not be quite as healthy, or that the vegetables themselves might not have the same micronutrient ratios as they would in sort of a more natural environment.
There are several studies that have talked about the declining mineral content of our soil, and that results into the declining mineral content of the food. So even if we were eating the same cuts of steak from 100 years ago, we have fewer minerals and fewer B vitamins, and the same apple from 100 years ago and the same broccoli from 100 years ago. You can also look at things like the dramatic increase in the bushels of corn and soybean per acre. And so you can get more volume of seed, but we're not rewarding farmers for nutrient density of the food. We're simply rewarding them for more tons per acre. So you're going to get a higher tonnage with fewer vitamins and minerals per gram or per pound. And we add to that, our food is now transported long distances, so the time between harvest and consumption is longer. So the vitamin content's going to decline, the antioxidant content will decline. The intake of the micronutrients, the food, vitamins, minerals, dramatically down from 100 years ago. 100 years ago, most Americans had gardens, and the time between picking and eating was a day. Because you go out to your garden, you pick your food, you bring it in, wash it, and eat it.
Well, cool. That is a bevy of really, really good information, and it's a little bit off subject for this podcast in general, which is a little bit about brain enhancement drugs, and obviously everything we've been talking about is very nutritionally focused, but it so relates to neurological health that I think it's definitely something people are going to find really, really interesting.
When I do my lectures, Jesse, I'm mindful that I spend a fair amount of time now talking about it's important to learn how to grow your own food, to grow food in containers. You can sprout your own food. You can grow mushrooms in the dark. If you have access to sunlight, you can grow food in a container garden. You have fresher food at much less cost. And if you don't, if you're growing it in your house, you can still just have sprouts and mushrooms. So you can still get some great nutrition at very low cost.
Yeah, good note, because that's definitely one thing that's true, is that your cost of food goes up quite a bit per month when you try to shift to a much healthier diet, although on the long term, you're going to save a ton of money on medical expenses later down the road.
In our study, my subjects told me that cost goes up, some say about 30%. I have had other subjects say, well, when you really face up to the fact that you're not going out to eat, you're not getting the junk food, you're spending money on food that's good for you. And if you're paying attention to this, working with getting a local farmer for your meat or a community-sponsored agriculture to get your produce. Some of my study subjects swear that they've not increased their spending on food.
Any last words you'd like to leave us with? If not, that was actually a great little final quip to go out on.
Well, a couple things. I'd like to have people go to my website, terrywahls.com. Be sure you sign up for my newsletter so you can get our monthly information, the health tip and recipes. We, person to person, have to spread this message that there are tremendous champions out there trying to teach the public how to reclaim their health and vitality through their own direct actions.
Absolutely. We'll be putting a link to your website and to your book on the podcast notes for this. And also, everybody should know that your last name is spelled Wahls, which might not be what they first try. Yeah, I too have a difficult to spell last name, and am plagued with that. So I know where you're coming from.
Oh, Jesse, I realized I never told you about the speed of the coming back of my cognition.
Oh, yeah, let's definitely talk about that. I'd love to.
Let's sort of run through the sequence of what came back first. So, I started in November. At that point, I clearly have problems with memory, with attention. I can't sit up in a regular chair. The first thing that came back from my procession was mental alertness, mental clarity. Fatigue began to reduce. Those were things that I could see at 3 months. I will tell everyone that was a black belt, competed nationally in 1978, bronze medalist at the trials for the Pan American Games in full contact free sparring and women's welterweight.
Nice.
When I began my electrical therapy training for my muscles, I was willing to train at extreme world-class athlete levels that we're never going to ask our study subjects to train at. Because, well, for one, the IRB would never approve that. And it's not realistic to think that the public's going to train at those kind of elite levels that I was willing to train at. In general, people will come back, but they won't come back at quite the speed that I came back in terms of mobility.
Now, do you find that the mental clarity bounce back, it sounds like was a faster process than the physical bounce back, especially for most people?
Much faster. And I have lots of experience with that in my primary care practice, in my traumatic brain injury practice. And it would appear to me that is a pretty universal experience, that people come back in and they tell me that their mood's clear, their thinking is clear, and the guys nearly always say, "You know what, Doc, my love life is so good." And they're smiling, they got a twinkle in their eye.
Nice.
It's very nice. It's very nice. These young guys don't need Viagra; they need vegetables.
There's a quote for us to put somewhere. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Don't need Viagra; you need vegetables.
Pfizer's going to hate you.
Well, there'll be a lot of folks. The MS drug industry, it's a $15 billion industry for these very expensive designer drugs that are very potent poisons to a very specific aspect of the immune cycle. What I'm doing is I'm addressing that 70 to 95% of the environmental factors that are driving the MS and, frankly, every other chronic disease problem in America. And by teaching people that we control that 70 to 95%, and we can incrementally fix all those behaviors to health maximizing behaviors month by month. Your symptoms lessen, your cells begin to heal. I'll tell you, the other thing that's so fun to see is my patients youthing. And they come in every 3 months, they're looking younger, they're looking younger, they're looking younger. The docs, my own personal physicians say, my God, Terry, you're looking younger than the last time I saw you.
That's an amazing thing to be able to say. When will the peer reviews on this first round of studies that you've done be publicly available?
The peer review process can take 1 to 3 months, because usually what they do is they'll come back with a list of, please address these things, and they'll list out the things they have to go addressed, and I rewrite my paper, send it off, and hopefully they'll say, okay, we like it, and then it's accepted. And then, depending on what the journal says, they will either fast track it because it's so exciting and say, okay, we'll put it in next month's issue, or you have to wait your turn, and then that might be 6 months, or depending on the lag, it might be a year. So this is sort of madly. It might be available in 3 months for the public, or it might be a year. Or, another possibility is that these journalists will say, we can't accept this because of, and they'll list the reasons why they think the science was bad or whatever. And they'll say, don't publish. And then, so I'll get a rejection notice. And then I'll go find another journal and submit it to a different journal.
Thank you very, very much. It's been almost an hour we're talking here, so I will let you get back to your evening, but really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. So a big whopping thank you to Dr. Terry Wahls for joining us for this interview. I would also really recommend checking out her TEDx talk, which she gave, which is how I first heard about her, and I thought was a very, very interesting one. If you just Google TEDx Terry Wahls, I'm sure that'll come right up. Again, her last name is spelled Wahls, not like running your head through brick walls. Moving it right along, next week we're going to be back to having people with extra acronyms in their name, but this will not be an MD or a PhD. This will be a .esq. We're going to have a lawyer on talking about smart drugs and some of the interesting legal ramifications that have to do with getting your hands on some of the things which we would classify as smart drugs. So stay tuned for that episode, but right now let's jump over to the
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
All right, so for this Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, I want to share with you guys a little bit of a mystery. Now, maybe this is just me being weird and kind of speculating fruitlessly in something which might be totally inaccurate, but let me read you this email that I got I guess this was 2 days ago this came in. This is from somebody who calls themselves Leo. Leo said, "Hello, Jesse. I just started listening to your podcast, and you provide great information on smart drugs and improving people's quality of life. I look forward to listening to a lot of your podcast and receiving your newsletter. I really found the podcast on modafinil experience to be great info for myself to experiment with. I can't find the link on your mobile site of recommended vendors from podcasts to purchase modafinil online. What trusted vendors online would you recommend to purchase modafinil online? Thank you. Your help is greatly appreciated. Leo." Now, I just don't think this is a legitimate email. I don't think this is a real email actually written by somebody named Leo looking for this information. The English is a little bit stilted, and sure, Leo might not be English might not be his first language, but I just kind of have a feeling that this might be a modafinil vendor trying to find out if I'm plugging one modafinil site versus another when people email me to the site, because it doesn't seem, there's some clues here, okay, right? I look forward to listening to a lot of your podcast and receiving your newsletter. Now, I've never sent out a newsletter, so that's just not true. There's I don't know. To me, it reads like some of these spam comments that people get on websites where it's not really a legitimate comment. It's just somebody writing something so they can link back to some other website. And oftentimes, the person writing the spam comment isn't the actual owner of the other website that's trying to get the link. It's just somebody that they've hired, sort of cheaply writing some comments to create backlinks to the website of whoever is employing them. So I think that Leo's a mole, man. I don't trust you, Leo. I emailed Leo back and I asked him who he was writing to me for, himself or someone else. And so I'm hoping to hear back from Leo. And Leo, gosh, I apologize so much if you're a real person and this is a legitimate email. I'd feel freaking rotten. But I don't know. I'm not trusting this one. I would be very curious to see what other listeners think, whether this is a legit email or not. Anyway, so that's the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick this episode. To be continued.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
All right, you heard it. That is the episode. Thank you very much for hanging out till the end. That was all of episode number 15. And we'll be back at you next week. If you liked the podcast, please tell your friends, tell everybody, and leave us a review on iTunes if you're feeling particularly kind and gentle-hearted. The show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com with everything that we talked about here. And I will be back at you next week. You might notice that this week actually did get published an episode within one calendar week of last week's episode. So I'm becoming a man of my word, slowly but surely, on the release schedule on this. Have a great week and keep yourself smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smart should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.